What if I told you that mushrooms might be the reason you can think, speak, and question your own existence right now? Not metaphorically, not spiritually, literally. There's a theory, backed by actual scientists, that suggests psychedelic mushrooms didn't just influence human evolution, they triggered it. They gave us language, self-awareness, and the ability to imagine things that don't exist. Forget everything you think you know about mushrooms being simple organisms. What you see popping up through the dirt is just a fruiting body, the equivalent of an apple on a tree. The real organism lives underground, and it's called mycelium. This stuff spreads through the soil in massive networks that can stretch for miles. The largest living organism on Earth isn't a blue whale or a giant sequoia. It's a fungal network in Oregon that covers 2,385 acres and weighs more than 3 blue whales combined. This thing has been alive for thousands of years, quietly spreading beneath the forest floor. Here's where it gets weird. Mycelium doesn't just grow randomly. It makes decisions. Scientists have run experiments where they place mycelium networks in mazes with food sources at different points. The fungus doesn't just spread everywhere hoping to find food. It actively explores, remembers dead ends, and optimizes its growth pattern to reach nutrients using the shortest possible routes. It's solving problems without a brain, without neurons, without anything we'd recognize as a thinking organ. The structure itself looks disturbingly similar to neural networks in your brain. Those branching interconnected threads mirror how your neurons connect to each other. Even more bizarre, researchers discovered that mycelium uses electrical impulses to communicate across its network. When one part of the fungus encounters food or danger, it sends signals through the entire organism. The patterns of these electrical spikes look remarkably similar to the way neurons fire in animal brains. We're talking about an organism that operates like a distributed intelligence, processing information across its entire body rather than centralizing it in one location. If you're sitting there thinking this sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie, stick around because we're just getting started. Hit that subscribe button right now because what comes next is going to fundamentally shift how you see the natural world and your place in it. Back in the early 1990s, an ethnobotanist named Terence McKenna proposed something so outrageous that most academics dismissed it immediately. He called it the stoned ape theory. The basic idea goes like this. Around 2 million years ago, our early human ancestors in Africa were dealing with a rapidly changing climate. Forests were turning into grasslands and the food sources were becoming scarce. These early hominids, desperate for nutrition, started following herds of animals and eating whatever they could find, including mushrooms growing in animal dung. Some of those mushrooms contain psilocybin, the psychoactive compound that makes you trip. McKenna argued that consuming these mushrooms regularly didn't just give our ancestors a weird afternoon. It fundamentally changed their brain chemistry and cognitive abilities. He pointed to studies showing that low doses of psilocybin improve visual acuity, making it easier to hunt. Medium doses increase sexual arousal, potentially boosting reproduction rates. High doses dissolve the boundaries of ego and create feelings of interconnectedness, which could have strengthened social bonds and community cooperation. But here's the kicker. McKenna believed that psilocybin directly influenced the development of language. The mushroom experience involves synesthesia, where your senses blend together. You might hear colors or see sounds. Your thoughts become more fluid, making unexpected connections between concepts. This kind of cognitive flexibility, repeated over thousands of generations, could have laid the neurological groundwork for symbolic thinking and abstract language. We went from grunting at each other to describing complex ideas, telling stories, and imagining futures that didn't exist yet. Now, most scientists think McKenna took this too far. There's no direct evidence that mushrooms caused the rapid brain expansion in human evolution. But the theory refuses to die because it touches on something real. Psychedelics do change how the brain processes information, and those changes can be profound and lasting. Your brain has a default mode network, or DMN. Think of it as your brain's autopilot system. It's the voice in your head that narrates your life, reminds you who you are, worries about what people think of you, and spends a lot of time either regretting the past or anxious about the future. The DMN is what creates your sense of self, That feeling of being a separate individual moving through the world. It's your ego, basically. When you take psilocybin, something fascinating happens. Brain imaging studies show that the DMN doesn't just quiet down, it gets significantly disrupted. The regions that normally fire together, creating that coherent sense of you, stop communicating in their usual patterns. Meanwhile, other parts of your brain that don't typically talk to each other suddenly start forming new connections. Your visual cortex might start chatting with your emotional centers. Your memory systems might link up with areas responsible for abstract thinking. This is why people on psychedelics report experiences that sound impossible to describe. Your rigid categories break down. The boundary between you and everything else becomes fuzzy or disappears entirely. People describe feeling merged with their surroundings, understanding that they're part of a larger system rather than a separate entity fighting for survival. Time stops feeling linear. Past, present, and future might blend together. Your thoughts stop being purely verbal and become visual, emotional, or something that doesn't fit into normal language at all. This isn't just hippie talk. Researchers at Johns Hopkins and Imperial College London have documented these experiences in controlled settings. They use something called the Mystical Experience Questionnaire to measure what happens. Participants consistently report feelings of unity with the universe, transcendence of time and space, deeply felt positive mood, and a sense of sacredness. Many people say these experiences rank among the most meaningful of their entire lives, comparable to the birth of a child or the death of a parent. What's happening neurologically is that your brain temporarily escapes its normal constraints. You're not thinking in your usual grooves and patterns. New neural pathways light up. Ideas that would never connect in your sober state suddenly seem obviously related. This cognitive flexibility is why psychedelics have been associated with creative breakthroughs and problem solving. You're literally thinking differently. The ego dissolution piece is particularly intense because most of us spend our entire lives reinforcing our sense of self. We build identities around our jobs, relationships, beliefs, and accomplishments. We defend these identities. We feel threatened when they're challenged. Psychedelics temporarily erase all of that. You get a glimpse of what consciousness feels like without the constant narrative of me running in the background. For some people, this is terrifying. For others, it's liberating. Humans have been using psychedelic mushrooms for thousands of years, and we have the receipts. In the Tassili N'Ajjer Mountains of Algeria, there are cave paintings dating back 7,000 to 9,000 years that depict humanoid figures covered in mushrooms. These aren't subtle little drawings tucked in a corner. They're prominent images showing mushrooms sprouting from people's bodies, suggesting these fungi held serious spiritual significance. The Aztecs called psilocybin mushrooms teonanacatl, which translates to flesh of the gods. They used them in religious ceremonies to communicate with deities and gain spiritual insights. Spanish conquistadors were horrified by this practice and tried to stamp it out completely, viewing it as demonic. They were so successful that the use of sacred mushrooms went underground for centuries. The knowledge survived only in isolated indigenous communities who guarded the tradition carefully. In the 1950s, a banker named R. Gordon Wasson traveled to Mexico and participated in a mushroom ceremony led by a Mazatec curandera named Maria Sabina. He wrote about the experience in Life magazine, and suddenly Western culture rediscovered what indigenous peoples had known forever. Mushrooms weren't just getting you high, they were doorways to something else entirely. The rituals around mushroom use in these ancient cultures weren't casual. You didn't just eat them at a party. There were protocols, intentions, and often a shaman or guide to hold space for the experience. The mushrooms were treated as sacred medicines, tools for healing and divination rather than recreational substances. The setting mattered. The mindset mattered. These cultures understood something that modern Western society is only beginning to grasp again. Psychedelics are powerful and they demand respect. So we've established that mushrooms behave intelligently. They solve problems, communicate, make decisions, and form networks that look and function like brains. They've potentially influenced human evolution and consciousness. But here's the question that keeps philosophers and biologists up at night. Are mushrooms themselves conscious? Consciousness is notoriously difficult to define. If you ask 10 scientists what it means, you'll get 10 different answers. Is it self-awareness? The ability to feel sensations? Having subjective experiences? A sense of being someone who's experiencing things? We can barely agree on whether animals other than mammals are conscious, so asking if fungi are conscious is stepping into seriously murky territory. But think about this. A mushroom network can sense its environment, remember past encounters, anticipate future needs, and coordinate complex responses across vast distances. It processes information. It adapts its behavior based on experience. It communicates. These are all things we associate with consciousness, at least at some level. The philosopher Peter Godfrey Smith wrote a book called Other Minds about octopus intelligence, and he makes a compelling point. Consciousness probably isn't an on-off switch. It's not like you either have it or you don't. It's more like a spectrum with different types and degrees of awareness. A mushroom network might not be conscious in the same way you are, with thoughts and feelings and a sense of personal identity, but it might have its own form of experience, something totally alien to how we process reality. Some researchers are taking this seriously enough to study it. There's a whole field called plant neurobiology that looks at how organisms without nervous systems still manage to behave in sophisticated ways. The signals traveling through mycelium networks show patterns of complexity that, frankly, we don't fully understand yet. Are those signals just mechanical responses, or is there something it's like to be a fungal network? We genuinely don't know. And we're about halfway through this journey down the rabbit hole, so if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Because we're about to get into the clinical research that's making mainstream science reconsider everything about consciousness, mental health, and what mushrooms can actually do for the human brain. While philosophers debate mushroom consciousness, medical researchers have been conducting rigorous clinical trials that are producing results so impressive that even skeptics are paying attention. Johns Hopkins University established the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research, the first of its kind in the United States. They've been running FDA-approved studies on psilocybin for depression, anxiety, addiction, and end-of-life distress in terminal cancer patients. The depression studies are particularly striking. Traditional antidepressants work for about 50 to 60% of people, and they often take weeks to kick in. The Johns Hopkins trials showed that a single high dose of psilocybin, combined with psychological support, produced rapid and sustained reductions in depression symptoms. We're talking about people who'd been depressed for years, who tried multiple medications that didn't work, suddenly reporting significant improvement that lasted for months after one session. Imperial College London ran similar studies and found comparable results. They did brain scans before and after psilocybin treatment and discovered something fascinating. In depressed patients, certain brain networks become overactive and rigid. Your thinking gets stuck in negative loops. You ruminate on the same problems over and over. Psilocybin disrupts those rigid patterns and allows the brain to form new connections. It's like shaking a snow globe. Everything settles into a different configuration. The research on end-of-life anxiety is even more profound. People dying of cancer often experience overwhelming existential distress. They're terrified of death, struggling with the meaninglessness of their situation, feeling disconnected from loved ones. A single psilocybin session in multiple studies produced dramatic reductions in this anxiety. Patients reported feeling at peace with their mortality, experiencing a sense of connectedness and meaning that persisted until their death. Family members described it as giving their loved ones back to them for the final weeks of life. Addiction treatment is showing promise too. There have been small trials on alcohol dependence and smoking cessation, where psilocybin-assisted therapy produced abstinence rates significantly higher than conventional treatment. The theory is that the ego dissolution and perspective shift helps people see their addiction from outside their normal patterns. They experience themselves without the addiction defining them, and that creates space for real change. The key thing to understand is that these aren't just about the drug. The studies all involve careful preparation, therapeutic support during the experience, and integration sessions afterward to help people process what happened. The mushroom opens a window of neuroplasticity and psychological flexibility, but what you do with that window matters enormously. Neuroplasticity is your brain's ability to rewire itself, forming new neural connections and pathways throughout your life. For a long time, scientists believed that your brain was mostly fixed after childhood. The neural pathways you developed early on would stay pretty much the same for the rest of your life. We now know that's not true. Your brain remains plastic, capable of change, but that plasticity decreases as you age. Your thinking becomes more rigid. You get set in your ways. Your brain settles into efficient patterns and stops exploring new territory. Psilocybin appears to temporarily supercharge neuroplasticity. Studies on rats given psilocybin showed increased growth of dendritic spines, the little branches on neurons that form connections with other neurons. More connections mean more potential for new patterns of thinking and behavior. The brain becomes more flexible, more open to change. This explains some of the therapeutic effects. Depression and anxiety often involve rigid thought patterns. Your brain gets stuck in loops of negative thinking, and you can't seem to break out. Trauma creates similar rigidity. Your brain forms strong associations between certain triggers and danger responses, and those associations are incredibly hard to rewire. Psilocybin loosens those rigid patterns and creates an opportunity for new learning. But it's not just about mental health. This increased neuroplasticity is why people report lasting changes in personality and perspective after psychedelic experiences. Studies have shown increases in openness, one of the big 5 personality traits that persist long after the drug leaves your system. People become more curious, more creative, more willing to consider new ideas. They report feeling more connected to nature, more interested in art and music, more comfortable with uncertainty. The creativity angle is particularly interesting. When your brain forms new connections and escapes its usual patterns, you're more likely to have insights and ideas that wouldn't occur to you normally. You make associations between concepts that seem unrelated in your ordinary state of mind. This is why so many artists, musicians, and creative professionals throughout history have experimented with psychedelics. They're not just getting inspiration from the visual hallucinations, they're literally changing how their brain processes information. There's also evidence that this enhanced neuroplasticity can help with learning. When your brain is more flexible, you're better able to acquire new skills, understand complex concepts, and break out of limiting beliefs about what you're capable of. The window of opportunity is temporary, but if you use it intentionally, the changes can stick. Let's zoom out from human brains for a minute and look at what mushrooms are doing on a planetary scale. Mycelium networks in forests don't just connect individual fungal organisms. They connect entire ecosystems. Scientists call it the wood wide web, and it's one of the most beautiful and bizarre discoveries in recent ecology. Trees in a forest aren't isolated individuals competing for resources. They're connected underground through vast fungal networks. A single mycelium network might link dozens or even hundreds of trees across multiple species. Through this network, trees share resources. A large tree with access to sunlight will send excess sugars through the fungal network to smaller trees struggling in the shade. When a tree gets attacked by insects, it sends chemical warning signals through the mycelium to neighboring trees, which then preemptively activate their own defenses. Mother trees, the largest and oldest in the forest, act as hubs in this network. They support their offspring, sending nutrients to young saplings that are genetically related to them. They also support other species, maintaining the biodiversity of the entire ecosystem. When a tree is dying, it dumps its remaining nutrients into the network, essentially giving its resources back to the community. The fungus isn't doing this out of altruism, it's getting paid. Trees photosynthesize sugars from sunlight, and trade those sugars to the fungus in exchange for water and minerals that the mycelium extracts from the soil. It's a symbiotic relationship that's been evolving for hundreds of millions of years. Nearly all land plants form these partnerships with fungi. Without them, plants couldn't have colonized land in the first place. What this means is that forests aren't collections of individual organisms. They're superorganisms, coordinated wholes behaving as single entities. The mycelium is the nervous system of the forest, processing information and coordinating responses across the entire ecosystem. When you walk through a forest, you're walking over what is essentially a planet-scale neural network. Ask any artist who's experimented with psychedelics about the creative process, and you'll hear similar themes. The experience doesn't just give you trippy visuals to paint, it fundamentally changes how you perceive relationships between ideas, emotions, and sensory information. Musicians describe hearing music differently, noticing layers and connections they'd never perceived before. Visual artists talk about seeing beyond the surface of things, understanding form and color at a deeper level. Writers report accessing parts of their psyche they normally can't reach, expressing emotions and thoughts that exist below the threshold of ordinary awareness. This isn't about creating while you're actively tripping, which most people find overwhelming and difficult. It's about what happens after. The experience leaves you with an expanded palette of perception. You remember that reality is more fluid and multidimensional than your everyday consciousness suggests. You carry that understanding into your creative work. Pattern recognition gets enhanced. You start noticing connections everywhere, how visual rhythms mirror musical rhythms, how emotional states have color and texture, how abstract concepts can be expressed through physical form. Synesthesia during the experience gives you a temporary taste of how arbitrary the boundaries between senses really are. Artists use this to create work that engages multiple senses simultaneously, even when the medium only targets one. There's also an emotional component. Psychedelics can surface deep feelings and help you process experiences you've been avoiding. When you bring that emotional honesty to creative work, it resonates with people. Your art stops being just technically proficient and becomes something that actually moves people, that touches something real and vulnerable. The danger, of course, is thinking the mushrooms are doing the creative work for you. They're not. They're tools that can open doors and shift perspective, but you still have to develop your skills, put in the hours, and refine your craft. Plenty of people have taken psychedelics and produced nothing of value. The substance creates possibility, but you have to actually walk through the door it opens. We've come full circle now, starting with the question of whether mushrooms are responsible for human consciousness, and we've explored the science, the history, the ecology, and the subjective experience. So what's the answer? Maybe consciousness was never created at all. Maybe it was always there, woven into the fabric of reality itself, and what we call being conscious is just one particular way of tuning into it. Mushrooms might not have given us consciousness. They might have just helped us access deeper levels of it, shown us that awareness exists in forms we can barely comprehend. Think about it, a mycelium network spanning acres of forest, processing information, making decisions, coordinating responses across vast distances. Is that so different from what's happening in your skull right now? Your consciousness emerges from billions of neurons firing in patterns. The forest's intelligence emerges from trillions of fungal cells, communicating through chemical and electrical signals. Different scales, different substrates, but maybe the same fundamental process. When you take psilocybin and your ego dissolves, when you feel connected to everything around you, maybe that's not an illusion created by scrambled brain chemistry. Maybe it's a glimpse of something that's actually true. Maybe the separation you feel the rest of the time, the sense of being an isolated individual separate from the world, maybe that's the illusion. Maybe consciousness is the ground of all beings, and we're all just temporary patterns within it, waves in the same ocean, notes in the same song. Or maybe mushrooms are something even stranger. Maybe they're interfaces, biological technologies that allow different forms of consciousness to communicate across impossible gulfs. When you consume them, you're not just getting high. You're establishing a connection with an intelligence that's been on this planet far longer than anything we'd recognize as human. An intelligence that speaks in feelings and visions instead of words, that thinks in networks instead of linear logic, that experiences time as something completely different from how we perceive it? What if we're not the only conscious beings on Earth? What if consciousness has been here all along, in forms we never thought to look for, using languages we're only beginning to understand? What if the mushrooms have been trying to tell us something this whole time, and we're only just now learning how to listen? That's the real question. Not whether mushrooms created consciousness, but whether we're ready to accept that consciousness might be far stranger, far more widespread, and far more mysterious than we ever imagined.